by then. Now, face the facts. John Waite investigates criticism of the RSPCA.
That Tuesday morning, I'll never forget it. When I saw those police vans at the gate and the RSPCA vans and waving that warrant, that bit of paper, I'll never forget what they've done.
They pulled me from my cottage and I hadn't finished dressing and I had to sit in the garden and it was getting cold.
Two people who say they've been at the sharp end of the RSPCA's mission to eradicate animal cruelty. The first runs an animal sanctuary, which was raided by the RSPCA. 6 months later, the charity admitted it should never have happened. The woman is a 68-year-old pet owner whose home was also raided. After being told she faced prison, 11 out of 13 charges against her were dropped and she was given a conditional discharge. This week we hear concerns that the RSPCA, which has nearly doubled the number of prosecutions it takes in the past couple of years, is abusing its power. Only the Crown Prosecution Service takes more cases to court. We'll also hear claims that the charity persecutes vets and lawyers who challenge it in court. But then the RSPCA owes its very existence to a 19th century MP who deliberately used prosecution as a means of changing attitudes to animal welfare.
A private member, Richard Martin, persuaded Parliament to pass legislation protecting animals in 1822, which predated the Metropolitan Police. And at that time, what used to happen was that if a criminal offence was committed against you as an individual, your house was burgled, for example, you would bring the prosecution. The state tended not to intervene.
Mike Radford from Aberdeen University is the author of Animal Welfare Law in Britain.
So Richard Martin got this legislation through Parliament, but there was no one to enforce it. He was a barrister. He brought private prosecutions himself. So he employed a man and gave him a uniform, a frock coat, silver buttons, peaked hat. And they used to bring prosecutions. This all got a bit too much for Richard Martin to do on his own. So a group of really very well-connected people, William Wilberforce, the anti-slavery campaigner, was amongst them, got together and set up an organisation which they called the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. And it had two aims initially. One was to educate and the other was to prosecute and enforce the law. What has happened in the ensuing period is that the state has largely stood back and allowed the RSPCA, as it became, to fulfil this function.
So for nearly 200 years, the RSPCA has had this role?
Yes, and it is doing it without any formal powers at all. An RSPCA inspector has no more power than you or I do.
Georgina Langley is 68 and lives in a pretty Kent village, these days sharing her end of terrace cottage with 3 cats and Sweetie the Jack Russell.
She gives me so much. She gives me a purpose to live. That sounds funny, but that's how I feel.
Mrs. Langley takes in abandoned animals and would admit her home isn't the tidiest, partly at least because a bad hip gives her limited mobility. In June last year, her collection comprised 13 cats, 4 cockerels, and of course Sweetie. Then the RSPCA paid a visit and checked out Sweetie's health, promising to return to check on the cats. She says that never happened. Instead, accompanied by the police, they raided the place.
They pulled me from my cottage and wouldn't let me go in, and I hadn't finished dressing. All I had was my nightshirt and my jogging bottoms, and I had to sit in the garden with Sweetie, and it was getting cold. It was so cold, and I called that wicked.
The RSPCA destroyed 5 of the cats and laid 13 charges against Georgina. When her vet, David Smith, learned of what had happened, he was aghast.
I thought it was very heavy-handed to rampage round her house, leave her outside the house in the rain, and to put down animals that I thought would have very little wrong with them. I demanded to see the animals, and I checked them all. Of the dead animals, I sent 2 to the Royal Veterinary College for post-mortem, and I have the results of the post-mortem. Basically, none of the claims made by the RSPCA were correct. They had not been poorly looked after. The male cat was in exceptionally good condition, and the female cat, also in good condition, had 3 kittens inside it. I doubt if anything needed doing, but they could have gone along from time to time to make sure she was managing. They could have asked about her financial position, whether she needed any help feeding the cats, etc.
As Georgina was deemed to be vulnerable, she was made a ward of court for the proceedings. At the final court hearing, the RSPCA dropped 11 of the 13 charges. She pleaded guilty to 2 charges of failing to meet animals' needs, for which she received a conditional discharge. Some of her surviving animals were later returned to her. Cases like this, says vet David Smith, are becoming all too commonplace.
When I started in 1974 in Dover, I worked alongside the RSPCA officer. He tended to have a very quiet approach. His objective was to help. And on many occasions he would simply go along taking flea treatment, etc. If they were old, he'd make sure the animals were treated, and he would pop back from time to time to make sure that everything was running correctly. Latterly, the RSPCA seems to have turned itself into some sort of police force, whose only objective seems to be to take people to court. I can only think that they are after publicity, and I think misguidedly they think they're going to get more money into the charity.
David Smith isn't the only vet to be concerned about the behaviour of the RSPCA. Colin Vogel, a vet in Norfolk for more than 40 years, has appeared for the defence in scores of animal cruelty cases, and as a result, he says, the charity has attempted to discredit him.
They have told lawyers that I lie in the witness box. They have made what have been referred to as scabrous reports to courts about me, and they have reported me to the Society of Expert Witnesses, the Law Society, the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons, basically anyone they can think of, because their view is that vets should not appear as defence experts. Once a vet has appeared as a defence expert more than a couple of times and those prosecutions have been unsuccessful for the society, they start attacking the vet concerned.
Indeed, so concerned was Mr. Vogel that, under data protection legislation, he obtained a number of RSPCA documents and emails that referred to him, one dubbing him the Society's arch-enemy. Ironic, really, given that some years ago Mr. Vogel penned something of a standard work on the care of horses, which the RSPCA was not only happy to endorse, but to have its name in the title. For the latest edition, however, the emails revealed the charity wished its initials to be removed, and that wasn't all.
What they then did, they then asked a vet with whom they work a lot, could you have a look at this book and see if you can find some fault with it that we can make big complaints about?
You know that for a fact?
Oh yes, I've got the email. Let me read you the paragraph. I know it was hoped that we would be able to criticise the content to an extent that we could refuse to be associated with it. To my enormous regret, I do not think we can easily proceed on those lines. There are a number of minor points which could be raised, but I could find nothing that was wrong or bad from the welfare point of view sufficient to give us a good case. Sorry. Now that tells you exactly what the RSPCA hoped to do over a book that they had been perfectly happy to endorse.
Hello, Bridget.
Yes, hello.
John Waite, Radio 4.
Oh, hello, been expecting you. Nice to meet you. Hold on.
Oh, look at all the animals gathering already.
Yes.
Just outside Potter's Bar in Hertfordshire, Bridget and Fred Brimley run the St Francis Animal Sanctuary.
It's almost 5 acres. Excuse me. It's almost 5 acres. We take in all sorts, abandoned, neglected. We've got 4 ponies at the moment, 2 goats, a few chickens. Most of them are ex-battery hens. How many dogs have we got? About 15.
How many have you got? About 15 dogs now,
15
yeah.
dogs.
Yeah.
20-some cats, a couple of turkeys that would have ended up on the dinner plate.
Until a few years ago, the Brimleys had a good relationship with the RSPCA, whose inspectors would visit from time to time. On the last occasion, in the summer of 2010, recommending that the couple fence in a separate paddock for their ponies and change from using a natural worming solution to a branded product. The Brimleys were happy to comply. They weren't so happy, however, at the tenor of the charity's follow-up visit.
They came in, looked at what we'd done, and then turned around and said to us, well, actually, you're not going to like this, but either you give us half your dogs and 3 of your ponies, or we'll storm in mob-handed and take everything.
Now, that is what they said.
That is actually what they said.
Mob,
yes.
They used the phrase mob-handed?
Yes, mob-handed, yeah.
The Brimleys were mystified. They'd done what the society wanted, hadn't they? Inspectors had access. Both sides agreed there'd be further discussions. What hadn't been agreed was exactly when. So the Brimleys were horrified when, out of the blue, their sanctuary was raided.
11 o'clock in the morning, 13th of July. They turned up at the gates, a couple of RSPCA vans, a couple of police vans. It was terrible. They were rattling the gate, shouting, "We've got a warrant, let us in." And we were absolutely shaking. There just seemed to be so many.
A hurried phone call brought local lawyer William Pumphrey to the scene, which he confirms was swarming with people.
There were so many, and I know this may sound an exaggeration, but it isn't. I made a memo at the time. There were so many RSPCA assistants, you could not count them. You could not count them. I have been in the law pretty well all my working life, but I felt intimidated by this.
I said to the inspector concerned, you did promise to come back for a visit so we could discuss this, and he wouldn't answer me. I was whitewashed over, really. I just...
We were dumbstruck. No dogs, nothing, no horses, everything gone, apart from these pet dogs, and they were going to take these dogs.
I mean, that is a very serious threat. I mean, it was completely out of order, utterly wrong thing to do. Because in law, either there was an animal welfare issue about the pet dogs, well, then the law permits the removal of animals that are, in fact, suffering. That's the point. So, in effect, what they were saying was that they were prepared to remove animals concerning which they actually admitted there and then there were no welfare issues at all. I mean, this has to be wrong on any footing. This is very seriously wrong.
Of course, then, the press gets the story. Tell me about that, because it appeared, I think, in The Sun, wasn't it?
What a disgusting place we were. You know, it wasn't true. It wasn't as bad as that at all. None of the animals were emaciated or dehydrated or filthy. The impact was horrific. We got a backlash from some people in the community. We had rattling on the gate late at night and abuse shouted. We did get a lot of support as well.
And what's been the impact on people who might have volunteered in the past, or donations you might have received?
Yeah, we tell people where we are. They look it up on the internet, and we don't hear from them again.
In the end, despite the raid, despite having their animals seized, and despite having their sanctuary described as squalid in the national press, neither Fred nor Bridget was ever prosecuted, and they carry on providing shelter for animals in need. Lawyer William Pumphrey was incensed and determined to get to the bottom of why the raid had supposedly been necessary in the first place. And at a meeting 6 months later between the RSPCA and the Brimleys, the truth finally came out. The pretext was a supposedly injured cat, but Mr. Pumphrey could find no evidence of such an animal, and he pressed officials from the charity that the feline was fictitious until...
Finally, the admission was made that the whole thing was a fabrication. It was just simply made up, that there never was any cat with a wound to its neck. The whole complaint was false to start with.
The RSPCA has 2 legal grounds on which they can ask the police to apply for a warrant for a raid. Firstly, that the charity has been denied access to premises, and secondly, that it is an emergency. Mr. Pumphrey and the Brimleys say the RSPCA knew in this case neither was true.
The whole proceeding was completely useless, a complete waste of everybody's time, a complete waste of money. All these people who make donations to the RSPCA, I mean, this is how they spend the money, completely uselessly.
For Barrister William Pumphrey, that was his first and, so far, only tangle with the RSPCA. Barrister Jonathan Rich has crossed swords with the Society on more than 100 occasions, but he told me never again. He used to represent defendants against the organisation, but, like vet Colin Vogel, he says that his track record of successes inside the courtroom was followed by a stream of complaints outside the courtroom, which cost him dear.
In a civilised society, everyone is entitled to an advocate, but you don't take on the persona of your client. But the RSPCA and its lawyers tend to regard those people who represent defendants as part and parcel of the defendants themselves. I have experienced a multiplicity of complaints, and it's cost me and my professional indemnity insurers over £1 million to defend.
And what do you believe lies behind this?
I've never been the subject of any complaint in any case where the RSPCA has not been involved.
Yeah, but Mr. Rich, you expect rough and tumble, don't you, in the courtroom? That's the way the UK's adversarial system works.
Well, reporting me to my regulator was not the only thing the RSPCA did to me. I experienced a series of correspondence that was actually sent to my clerks, making allegations of professional misconduct against me.
So, I mean, you're clearly implying here that because you take a lot of cases and you're successful in those cases that result in the defeat of the RSPCA, they have hounded you as a result.
Yes, I think that I and other people are an inconvenience to them. I think they would like to be able to do their job without the inconvenience of having lawyers and vets prepared to stand up for their clients.
So you're not alone in this, you say?
No, I'm not alone.
No complaint was ever upheld against Mr. Rich, and he hasn't taken a case involving the Society since 2008, since when he's never received a complaint about his professional behaviour. He has, however, got his own complaint about the RSPCA.
I think the RSPCA needs to stop prosecuting. It needs to put packages of cases together and present them to the CPS. I think that's the single most important thing the RSPCA could do. I think it's unlikely that it will want to do so from within. It's about time the government took action to try and alleviate the sort of human suffering which the charity is causing.
It seems unusual, to say the least, that the RSPCA brings its own private prosecutions rather than handing evidence over to the Crown Prosecution Service. That's what happens with its sister organisation in Scotland, the SSPCA, which investigates but then passes cases on to the Procurator Fiscal. The way the Royal Society prepares for prosecutions is also odd. Mike Radford's word, he's the animal welfare expert from Aberdeen University we heard from earlier. He's a staunch friend and former advisor of the charity, he says, but nevertheless, in his view, its procedures are open to abuse.
The inspectorate which carries out the investigation and the prosecution department within the RSPCA is very closely linked. Now, public prosecutions, there is a distinct separation between the police who do the investigation and the Crown Prosecution Service who decide on the prosecution and bring it if they consider it should go to court.
And that's a deliberate division?
It is a very deliberate division, because you will appreciate that if I'm investigating something, I have a vested interest in the case proceeding. So the idea is that the CPS brings a degree of independence and objectivity. Now, the way that the RSPCA prosecutions works is that the inspectorate on the road carry out an investigation. They would compile a file and send it through to RSPCA headquarters at Horsham to the prosecutions department, and there they have a number of what they call legal superintendents, not qualified lawyers. They are experienced inspectors. They do have some lawyers in the prosecution department. They will assess the case, and if they consider that it should be prosecuted, it is then sent to private solicitors who they employ around the country. So there is no distinct division between investigation and prosecution, which there would be in the public sector.
You think that's a legitimate concern?
I think it would be in everybody's interest, not least the RSPCA's, if their arrangements were similar to the arrangements of public prosecutors.
The other thing Mr. Radford believes is essential for the RSPCA is to adopt a proper complaints procedure. Because, again, unusually, unlike, say, the police, where complaints are heard by the Independent Police Complaints Commission, complaints against the RSPCA are heard by the RSPCA.
There is no independent element to it.
So something like an independent ombudsman would be your idea?
To restore faith, to protect the public and to protect its own staff.
Well, I've travelled to Horsham in Sussex, headquarters of the RSPCA, and I'm with its Chief Executive, Gavin Grant. What's the current rate of prosecutions, Mr. Grant, year on year?
It's going up, I'm afraid. We're seeing a greater depth to the levels of cruelty that animals are facing. Prosecution is always the last resort for the RSPCA. 98% of the 150 or so thousand cases we investigate are dealt with without prosecution, but sadly, in the worst of circumstances, and mainly to prevent people from owning animals again, we will prosecute.
So 3 years ago, I think you brought 2,500 prosecutions. 2 years ago, 3,000 odd. 2012, 4,000 odd. That is a hefty jump in prosecutions.
It is. The number of people being prosecuted is rising, but at a much lower rate than the figures that you're citing, which relates to the number of elements to the case. Now, that is a result of people acting in the most appalling manner to animals. What we'd much rather do is to warn people, is to guide people, and overwhelmingly, in 98% of cases, that is precisely what we do.
I mean, you have acknowledged that there is a link between bringing prosecutions and bringing in donations.
Well, there's a link in the sense that a large number of people applaud and are enthusiastic about the fact that the RSPCA is prepared to bring animal abusers to justice and are prepared to fund our work.
So are these prosecutions and their attendant publicity a way of raising your profile, therefore a way of raising cash?
No, they're not. They are a direct way of saying to people out there, you should treat animals with compassion and respect.
And that, Mr. Grant said, included Georgina Langley, the 68-year-old given a conditional discharge. She had vastly benefited from the Society's intervention, which had resulted in better living conditions for her and her pets. What about the Brimleys, however, and their animal sanctuary in Hertfordshire that was raided? Police time was wasted, and a great deal of money in the form of public donations to the charity was spent fruitlessly, as no prosecution ever resulted.
Probably the wisest course of action would have been to have given the Brimleys one more chance. And as such, I don't think that particular action of that particular raid at that particular time was appropriate.
See, the reputation of that animal sanctuary in Potter's Bar has been trashed, hasn't it, in the press at the time, online ever since. Won't you put out a statement explaining that it was you who got it wrong?
We are working with the Brimleys very closely, and it was not the RSPCA that put this matter into the public domain.
It's ironic, isn't it, and odd, according to one of those we've heard on the programme, that when it comes to complaining about the RSPCA and how they've behaved, it's the RSPCA who entertains that complaint. Yeah. The Crown Prosecution Service, if it gets it wrong, there's this independent ombudsman you can go to. If the police get it wrong, there's the IPCC. You're the second biggest prosecutor in the country, and yet it's you who decide whether you have erred.
The police and the Crown Prosecution Service are paid by yours and my taxes. Yours and my taxes don't pay a penny towards the RSPCA. We're an independent charitable body. It's certainly an area I'm prepared to look at, and indeed I'm holding discussions with my trustees on these matters. And it's certainly not something that the RSPCA would fear in any way, shape or form.
All right, but what about Mike Radford's concern that the RSPCA's investigation team and its prosecution team are too closely linked, too cosy?
They report to two entirely separate directors, so they're not part of one department. Inevitably, they're going to be part of the same organisation. They're part of the RSPCA.
Why don't you just hand over prosecutions to the Crown, as happens with your sister organisation in Scotland?
The RSPCA cannot. The Crown Prosecution Service take their cases from the police force. They won't take them from a private organisation, whether it's the RSPCA or you and I as individuals. And indeed, with the cuts to the police force and the CPS, the notion that we should pass everything to the police is simply fanciful also.
Now, what about these professionals that we've heard on the programme, these vets and these lawyers who say that you harass them if they appear regularly for defendants in animal cruelty cases?
Oh, that's a nonsense.
Well, we've heard from Barrister Jonathan Rich. He says he's had to give up taking cases involving the RSPCA because it cost his indemnity insurers more than £1 million.
Well, now, there's always an exception that proves the rule in anything, isn't there? And Mr. Rich is that exception. I suggest Mr. Rich should look to his own actions rather than questioning the society.
And then there's Colin Vogel, the society's arch enemy, it seems. We've heard an email on the programme whereby the society was trying to discredit his book on horse care.
Well, it's not an email I'm familiar with, but if it is correct, then that is simply not appropriate.
I mean, it's petty, it's sneaky, it's ill-deserving of an august organisation like yours.
There's no place for smears or innuendos or inappropriate conduct, as far as I'm concerned, inside the RSPCA.
So you would condemn that?
Absolutely.
But this is overall a growing perception, isn't it, of the RSPCA, that it's becoming heavy-handed rather than the helpful organisation you used to be.
We were founded by visionaries who believed in compassion and kindness to animals and to people. After all, coming to this building, you came down Wilberforce Way, and that's because William Wilberforce was one of the founders of the RSPCA. His track record and others at that meeting in opposing slavery, in opposing cruelty to children and opposing cruelty to animals, they recognised the circle of compassion that should apply to all living creatures, human beings, vets and lawyers as well.
You've been listening to Face the Facts. The programme was